Okay, so you're good to go, Dave.
Okay.
This should got it.
Well, I want to thank you all for inviting me in today. I guess what started this is last week, the Ohio Department of Agriculture nursery inspectors had me come over and give them some updates on management materials. And they started talking to me about the they were seeing in that people were having trouble with. And so this talk is, I've just titled it the tough to manage insects and mites in the nursery. The first one obviously is scales. Everybody apparently or quite a few people are experiencing some real outbreaks of scales in their nurseries. We still have some of the old traditional ones, things like the pine needle scale and oyster shell scale. And in the soft scales, we're still seeing a fair amount of European fruit licanium and calico scale. But the new kid on the block is the Japanese maple scale, another one of these arbored scales, which seems to be causing some real trouble. And we'll describe what's going on with that. Before I get there, I want to, again, get everybody on the page with scales, whether you're a soft scale, an armored scale, even a mealybug, it's considered to be a scale and has a very similar life cycle as these. Most scales do produce eggs. There are a few that actually produce eggs, but then the eggs are retained inside of the female, and she gives what appears to be live birth to the crawlers. But no matter how they do that, what we want to know is that the first nymphal instar that hatches out of the egg or emerges out of the female, we call a crawler. And hopefully that gives you the idea. This thing's going to move around on the plant, try to find a suitable place for it to insert its mouth parts in order to feed. And so the bottom line, I can't emphasize enough by this yellow balloon right here, that crawler has to feed. It has to eat something. Why is that good for us? Well, if I'm going to use a systemic insecticide, that's the one stage that will pick up that systemic insecticide. Now, the problem is what kind of scale am I dealing with? If I'm dealing with a soft scale, then the insecticide has to be in the vascular bundles and where the soft scales feed. If it's an armored scale, that systemic insecticide needs to be in the tissues where those scales are feeding. So there is a big difference, and not all systemic insecticides end up in the tissues. Many systemic insecticides are what we call translocated. They'll get into the vascular system and move up and down the vascular system, but they might not leak out of those vascular tissues into the surrounding tissues. So there's only specific ones that will get into the actual tissues. So that makes a big difference on which of those systemic insecticides I'm going to pick for my crawlers. And it depends on whether it's a soft scale or an armored scale. Now, another problem that we have with scales, this occurs both in soft scales and armored scales, is that once this crawler has finished its development, it molts into the second nymphal instar, and that second nymphal instar might stop feeding during the season. And many of these, if they're second instar nymphs in the heat of the summer, when the plant is under vascular stress, the scales kind of shut down too. They go into what we call summer estivation. And the bottom line, if they're not feeding, and if they happen to be an armored scale that has a protective covering over them, my contact insecticides aren't going to do anything to them. On the other hand, if they're a soft scale, even if they've stopped feeding, if I can hit them with something, since they don't have a waxy covering like the armored scales, I might even be able to kill them in that second instar. Now, the vast majority of scales have males and females. If they're a male scale, they go through an extra instar, which we call a pupal stage. This pupal stage doesn't feed at all. The mouth parts are no longer inserted into the plant. They're just the transformation stage in which they're going to form an adult scale, which is actually a little tiny winged insect. And of course, these males fly around, walk around to find the females to mate. Now, if it's a female scale, they don't go through this extra instar. They just molt directly from the second instar nymph into the adult stage. And this adult stage then, depending on the plant, depending on the species, may feed for some period of time and may stop feeding for some period of time. So I guess bottom line, if you think about it, knowing when this settled nymph is feeding, or knowing when the adult is feeding, can be very difficult. And there might not be any really signs of when they're feeding and when they're not feeding. And so if I'm going to use a systemic insecticide, this could be pretty iffy in here. But what that does mean is that if I'm going to use a systemic insecticide, I know that the crawlers have to feed, the subtle crawlers have to feed. And so for most scale control, we're now putting the emphasis on that crawler stage again. And actually, we used to do this all the time, because when we had primarily contact insecticides, the crawlers, whether they were soft scales or armored scales, was really the one exposed stage of the scale. Well, let's take a look at some of these. Here are some European fruit lecanium scales. When I get the call from most homeowners, especially, or landscape managers, it's when the females have puffed up and are beginning to produce eggs underneath their bodies, and they're dripping honeydew all over the place. And the bottom line is that while I might be able to kill these females, by the time they reach this stage, they probably have produced about half the eggs they're going to produce. Those eggs are under the protection of the shell of the female, or her exoskeleton. So contact insecticides aren't going to reach them, since those eggs aren't feeding. Systemic insecticides aren't going to reach them. And so, I'm really not going to do any good trying to target that. I suspect many of you have not seen male scales. And what I wanted to show you, this is European fruit lecanium scales. This is what they look like actually in my neighborhood right now. A lot of the people in my neighborhood have crab apples and purple leaf plums and pear trees, and they've got European fruit lecanium scales on them. When I look at the branches, it looks like there's these little oval white scales on the branches. These are actually the pupal cases. This white thing right here, that's actually the exoskeleton of the second instar nymph, and underneath that was the pupa. Once that pupa finishes development, it molts actually again underneath this cover, and you can actually see the wings of the adult male beginning to stick out here. So these little waxy threads with the wings is telling me that the males are just about ready to emerge. Again, these are not going to feed on the plant. You might be able to kill them with a contact insecticide, or like an oil or soap, but that's really kind of a waste of time, because the males don't lay the eggs. We do know that many of these scales can go ahead and reproduce even without mating with the male scales. Now, more importantly are armored scales. And hopefully you're all familiar with the oyster shell scale. Has this fairly, it's, about 1/8 of an inch long scale with a rounded test. And the waxy covering looks like an old oyster shell. So that's where they get the name for that. Here's one on a maple tree. You can see the old scales. These are the female tests that are on here. But what I really wanted you to notice is what the crawlers look like. All these little white dots on here are crawlers. Now, I point these out because remember that some plants, some stems have what we call lenticels. These are the little breathing pores that are on the stems of the plant. And these crawlers can look like the lenticels, but you can see the lenticels are very widely spaced apart, while these scale crawlers have all settled down. Now, if you've got a microscope and actually look at these under a microscope, you'll see the remnants of their legs sticking out from where these scales have settled down. Here's the pine needle scale. Again, it's an oyster shell shape, but it's a white with the little yellow exuvium on here. Now, this one I can tell is a female that's laid eggs. You can actually see a pink egg sticking out underneath the test here. When the eggs hatch into the crawlers are first a hot pink color. Once they've inserted their mouth parts and start feeding, they turn this sort of a straw yellow color. So I can tell whether they're still an active crawler or a settled crawler. Now over here on this one, you can see a crawler that has been settled down for probably about 2, maybe even 3 weeks. You could still see that its body is not covered with this waxy coating, that it's just beginning to. You can see just a little bit of wax that's beginning to form there. Why is this important? Well, if even at this stage, if I use a contact insecticide or I use a horticultural oil or an insecticidal soap, if I can contact at least 40 to 50% of this body with that spray, it's going to penetrate through their exoskeleton and kill them. And so that's again why our traditional scale control was always targeting the crawlers. Now, the one that we're worried about right now is this Japanese maple scale. It looks, again, it's a little bit kind of an oyster shell shape. To me, it looks sort of like a dirty gray color when I see it. That's very different than the true oyster shell scale, which will be brown in color. And you know, obviously it's not going to be the pine needle scale, which is perfectly white, but is only on conifers. Japanese maple scale has a very wide host range. There seems to be almost, you know, all of the deciduous hardwoods seem to be a potential host for this. But obviously it's most problematic on maples. See a lot of them on dogwood. In my neighborhood, there was a new development that went in and they planted a lot of serviceberry in the street lawns. And I swear every one of those serviceberries has this Japanese maple scale on it. So this is what it looks like. You can see that there's a whole bunch of little scales here on the bark. Now, this is a scale also that stays on the bark of the tree. The scales do not go out onto the petioles or the leaves of the host plant. Now, what we're finding with this Japanese maple scale, it's a fairly new one. There's only been a few studies that have been done. There's a couple of entomologists at the University of Maryland, which are scale taxonomists and scale experts. They have been doing some studies on the Japanese maple scale. I noticed recently on their fact sheet, they posted these degree day chart and notice that in Maryland, they're getting 2 generations of this scale. I believe, at least in the southern half of Ohio, we probably have 2 generations. We very likely have 2 generations, even in the northern part where you folks are located. So, you know, I'm just going to assume that we have 2 generations also here. Now, here's some details that I want you to notice. Notice that in Maryland, they saw the first crawler emergence at about 815 degree days. That's probably plus or minus, you know, 50 degree day units is what you're going to see. I always hate these hard numbers. People don't understand that it's always plus or minus some degree day units for that. That's probably going to be somewhere in the first or second week of June you know, at your location in Ohio. But notice that's just the first crawler emergence. Another 300 degree days later is at the peak. And they say that the crawlers can remain active for almost 2 months. And so basically what this is telling me is that even though I know the start date, these crawlers may continue to emerge over almost you know, definitely a 7-week period and almost an 8-week period, almost 2 months of activity. Then we see the start of the second generation. And if I add this out, that looks like 1,000 degree days, but if I actually add in the 4 extra weeks that are past this peak, I'm almost at the same time that the first generation crawlers have stopped emerging and settling, that I start a second generation of crawlers emerging. And that's kind of what we've seen. People down in Kentucky, people here in Ohio are saying, you know, every time I go out and look in the summertime, it looks like there's been some crawlers that have emerged and settled on the plant. So what that really means is that it looks like we've got almost a 3-month window that we've potentially got crawlers emerging and active. Now, how are we going to deal with that? Well, I'm not going to worry about the second generation. I'm going to concentrate. Can I take out the first generation to, try to zero it out and take it out? And the idea would be, let's use a systemic insect that we know gets into the tissues, and that would be something like dinoteffuron. Or if you're in a nursery, you still have dimethoate. We know that one got into tissues of plants and was very good for armored scale control. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to apply it the first day of crawler emergence. I'm going to wait maybe a week to 2 weeks after that. So what I'm looking at, if these are coming out in the first week of June, I'm probably going to wait till the second or third week of June to make my systemic insecticide application, knowing that when I use one of these water-soluble insecticides, like the dinoteffuron or the dimethoate, it's going to get into the plant probably within 5 to 6 days and be at effective levels, and should remain there for about 4 weeks at effective levels. So about 4 weeks later, I'm going to make a second application of that, and what that should do. The first application to take out all of the first crawlers that emerged. The second application should zero out all of the late emerging crawlers from that first generation. And if I take them all out, I shouldn't even have a second generation. But, what I would suggest is that, again, you would contact those of us that are at Ohio State. And if you don't have a microscope to look at these under the microscope to see if all of the crawlers are dead and there's no live scales there, or send them to me down here in the Columbus area, we can make arrangements for that to get done, and we can take a look at them and find out, did you really zero out the population and thus have no further need for more applications in the second generation. I've talked about the insecticides. These are the scale control products that we have available for nursery production. Notice that there are some that are only nursery. Dimethoate can only be used in the nursery. Can't use that in the landscape any longer. Most of the orthene formula for nursery, but there are a couple of orthene formulations that still can be used in urban landscapes. Now, remember that most of these are the traditional contact insecticides, except for the orthene and dimethoate, both of which are systemic. Orthene has never been really good on scale control. It does fairly well on soft scales, doesn't do very well on armored scales. But dimethoate has always been an excellent product for both armored scales and soft scales. And so, this is an old product. A lot of people have turned to new materials, but I just want to remind you, it's still there, still should be a pretty effective material. Now, when it comes to the newer products, we have 4 neonicotinoids here. We've got imidacloprid, and I'm going to put imidacloprid and clothianidin in the same boat first. These have low water solubility. That means that they have slow uptake in the plant, and they will only remain in the vascular system. So that's why they only have soft scales for control. Dinoteffuron and acetamiprid under Safari and TriStar. These are water-soluble neonicotinoids. So these are ones that will leak out the vascular bundles and get into the other cellular tissues where the armored scales are feeding. And so that's why both of these have armored scale on the label. Now, last one I'm going to mention here is a insect growth regulator, Distance or Talus. And I mentioned these because there was a big discussion on the Japanese maple scale about 2 weeks ago among the ornamental entomologists. And one of the entomologists said, my nursery producer said that he's heard that using one of these insect growth regulators has been maybe a better strategy for scales. Has anybody done the testing? And I figured there might be maybe somebody, just one person, but surprisingly, there were 3 other entomologists that said, yes, we've done replicated field tests in the field. It seems to be an excellent product, even against the Japanese maple scale. And typically the way that they've used this distance is that they wait until that peak emergence. Remember on that degree day chart where I had peak emergence of the first generation of the crawlers. They've applied distance with a 2% or 3% horticultural oil, or with a something to a spreader sticker kind of material. And virtually the results on all of those tests, the 3 major tests that were done with replicated trials, ended up in zeroing out or almost completely zeroing out the Japanese maple scale. So if you're having trouble with these other products, I know these insect growth regulators are kind of complicated molecules to make, but they seem to be working very well on some of these insects that have shown a lack of good control using our traditional either systemic insecticides or contact insecticides. Okay, so just to reiterate, keys to the successful scale control of all sorts: make the applications that when the crawlers have settled. You don't need to make the application with first emergence. Probably make the application of peak crawler emergence, because you do have about a 3 to 4 week window to kill those crawlers. Those crawlers can be killed with a contact insecticide, but if you're going to use a contact insecticide, make sure that you have to really cover all of the plant where those crawlers have settled. When it comes to the systemic neonicotinoids, dinoteffuron and acetamiprid are the 2 that have the fastest uptake in the plant, move into the soft tissues of the plant or the cellular tissues of the plant, where they can pick up the armored scales, because that's where the armored scales are feeding. Again, consider using dimethoate. It's still available, still can be used for nursery production. And then again, if you're really having trouble, if none of this has worked for you in the past, consider using one of the insect growth regulators. And again, the recommendation is to apply that with hort oils. Briefly, I've had this question numerous times already this year. We've had some conferences on the hemlock woolly adelgid, and we're talking about systemic insecticides. I want to remind you that we have several terms that are used with systemicity. Translaminar, lamella, means going across a membrane. And what that means is that if I have a translaminar insecticide, if I spray it on the upper surface of the leaf, yet I've got aphids or scales on the undersurface of the leaf, that leaf tissue will absorb that insecticide, and it will be in the tissues where those insects are feeding, and it will kill the insects that are on the underside of that. The bad part of the translaminar is that that insecticide will not leave the leaf. It will only stay in the tissue where I sprayed it. Translocated means across a new location. So that means that if I spray it in one part of the plant, it will be moved to another part of the plant. Now, when we're using an herbicide, we want to be able to spray the foliage, and that herbicide would go down and kill the roots. That's what we call basipedal translocated. Now, no insecticides are basipedal. All our insecticides are acropedal. That means that if I get them into the root or inject them into the vascular bundles of the plant, they'll move up those vascular bundles, up the stems, the branches, the petioles, and into the foliage. So that means that they will move up the plant. And let's say if I only applied that translocated systemic as an injection right here in the middle of the trunk, it would go only from that spot upward. It would not go there and protect the lower part of the trunk. That's why when you often see these acropedal translocated systemics, we say soil drenches are better, or injection at the root flare is the best place, because that means the whole plant then is covered by that translocated systemic insecticide. Okay, I'm going to take a quick break right here. Are there any questions on that? I've got some more critters.
And you got any in your room there, or any questions?
Guys, have any questions?
Is anybody still alive?
I got a question on resistance to oil.
Oh, okay, Dave, one question on resistance to, good, just ask.
Yeah, I forgot to ask this last time, but I've heard of that in the past, that some scales are actually developing resistance to oils. Is that something you've seen?
My feeling is that because of the mode of action, most people say that the oils suffocate the insects. It's not that. Oils penetrate through the microtubules of the exoskeleton and kill the underlying cells. And the only way that you develop resistance for that is to get rid of those microtubules. And if you did that, you're going to die. There's no way to support your exoskeleton. So I think developing resistance is highly unlikely. What it usually, when we're using these contact materials, soap, oils, or other contact insecticides, it's usually a lack of good coverage. Now, when it comes to these scales, also remember that the armored scales have that protective waxy covering over the top of them. And so the only way that a dormant oil or horticultural oil is going to kill the insect that is under that cover is to leak under the cover and make contact with the side of the insect. And unless you're really drenching the plant, that's probably not going to happen. You're just not going to get enough under that exoskeleton or that test or that waxy covering to make contact with the insect to kill it.
Any other questions, Ann, or? So why don't you proceed, Doc? Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
So any kind of like off-season dormant oil sprays or ultra-fine spray oil is kind of a waste of time, is what you're saying?
Oh, absolutely not. Remember that things like insect eggs, mite eggs, and even I've seen really good results if you can use a horticultural oil at time of peak crawler settling, you can get very good control of that. And it may not be good enough for the nursery where you really want to zero things out so the inspector doesn't find anything or your customer doesn't see anything. But at least in the urban landscape, that's been very satisfactory. We keep these pests down to a low enough level that quite often the natural predators and parasites will finish off what remains. And so the landscape plants stay pretty clean. In a nursery situation, you could be in a different boat. You really need pretty clean plants so that nobody can actually find what might be there. Good questions.
Okay, you want to move on and we'll try to.
Yeah, I'm going to briefly talk about some of the other borers, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the agrillus borers, but I do want to mention to those of you that are in nursery production, I see two real problematic agrillus species. That's the honey locust borer and the two-line chestnut borer. Now, the two-line chestnut borer is going to be attacking oaks. The honey locust borer is going to be attacking the honeylows. What I find is that when you dig these plants, or even if you've got containerized oak trees or honey locust trees, when they are moved to the garden center, they may not get watered on a regular basis there. And when they experience a little bit of drought stress, especially in that early June to mid-June window, that's when both of these borer adults are out. They can often lay plants on those, or lay eggs on those plants while they're still in the garden center. Then when the homeowner takes them home, plants them, they notice, later on or that next spring that they've got the D-shaped emergence holes. They may have, plant death or a significant portion of the plant dying off from that. The way to stop that is just drench these plants just before they leave the nursery. Imidacloprid's the cheapest thing. You could just drench the root ball or the container. That will protect those plants for that first season from getting either one of those borers in those plants. And then you won't have the problem of a dead plant the next spring. So you might just mention that. It might be an additional service that you could offer to your customers if they're going to have these plants on their lot. Another one that I'm seeing is the flat-headed apple tree borer. This one seems to, I've always stated that it's not the right name for this. This ought to be the flat-headed, I'll attack any deciduous hardwood that's grafted borer. I think that's a little too long a name, but it adequately describes it. So, we see a lot of these maple cultivars, we see beech cultivars, and so forth that are grafted. And this rascal loves to hit those at the graft junction, usually again in that first or second year after transplant. I don't see much of it in the nursery, but right after that transplant, this would be another one that you might pre-treat those trees for at least that first season to get them through the season without being attacked by this borer. Another one that we're seeing both in the nursery as well as in the landscape is in the peach tree borer. I always kind of joke with people, if they're stupid enough to plant a prunus, they deserve this. Now that's easy for me to say, but because, people like their flowering cherry and their flowering plums and so forth. So they're always going to be out there. This is the one that the larva is a caterpillar, always attacks. Now it's kind of hard to see here, but the root flare of this flowering cherry trees right here, and you can see this, what I call gummosis. It's kind of a gummy, gooey mass at the bottom of this. It's basically the sap that's mixed with the frass of the larva in here. And once you get one larva in a tree, not much of a problem, but if you get 3 or 4 larvae attacking the base of the tree, it can girdle it and kill it. And these can be pretty tough to control, because most of the normal borer insecticides that we think about don't really do a very good job against caterpillars. And so what are we going to do to apply for that?
Hey, Dave.
Yeah.
Do you want to delineate between lesser and greater peach tree borer as far as location to damage?
Yeah, the lesser peach tree borer is going to be typically if you got top grafted or high grafted prunus, some of these weeping cherry trees and so forth, they're typically going to be up in that graft junction. They'll not be at the base of the tree. And that's a whole different ball game with that one. But it's the peach tree borer that usually kills the plant because it's going to girdle it. And since it's usually below the mulch layer of the plant, at least in the landscape, the homeowner it until after it's girdled the plant. Then they call me and wonder why it's got bark beetles. And I say, well, it was girdled by the peach tree borer. And they say, well, what's my remedy? And I usually say, do you have a chainsaw? That's the best thing to go with them. Now, let's talk about the caterpillars first. Dimethoate, orthene, dimolin. These are all products that can kill caterpillars. When it comes to the neonicotinoids, we know that acetamiprid has caterpillars on the label. And while it doesn't have peach tree borer on the label, I've had very good success with acetamiprid. And in my, I've got cherry trees and peach trees. I've had very good success for about every other year drenching the base of those trees with acetamiprid, and that has kept them out. Now, of course, I don't make that application until after blooming is over because I don't want any of that up in the flowers of the plant where the pollinators might pick it up. When it comes to the beetles, virtually all of the neonicotinoids do a good job, imidacloprid, dinotefuran. Now, notice that I have clothianidin with a bunch of question marks on it. And the reason for that is clothianidin really doesn't have that on the label. But I know it works. And remember, if a product in Ohio is registered for a site, meaning like nursery production or trees or something like that, and I think it will kill a target insect, I can use it. Now that's different than in New York. In New York, you have to have both the target and the pest specifically listed on the label before you can use it, but we don't have that here. So those would be, you can see a lot of these insecticides are the same ones that we talked about for the scale controls. Lastly, when it comes to the ambrosia beetles, I'm going to skip through a bunch of this. The reality is when it comes to ambrosia beetles, our #1 ambrosia beetles that's been determined here in Ohio, especially in our nursery production, but also in freshly transplanted trees, is the black stem borer. There's been a lot of research that was done by the USDA researchers out of Worcester. Basically, they've determined that it is when the trees are basically waterlogged in the springtime, those waterlogged plants begin their sugars into alcohol. And this is ethyl alcohol, not methanol, but ethyl alcohol. And so ethyl alcohol seems to be the attractive ingredient that attracts the black stem borer and these other ambrosia beetles to get into the plants. How do we know when they're there? I recommend using, some people are using trap logs. It's basically sections of a log, a piece of the tree that you know is susceptible. They drill a hole down one end of it, fill it with ethanol, and apparently that will leak out through the tissues and will attract beetles to go into that bolt or that piece of wood. I'm an old fashioned one. I use these traps, which have, it's basically nothing more than a 2-liter container with some windows cut in it. You can get just a little pill vial, fill that with ethyl alcohol. Now remember, ethyl alcohol is in shellac thinner. So if you want a cheap source of ethanol, you can go to the paint store or the hardware store and get denatured alcohol. Has a little methanol in it, but not enough to discourage the beetles from being attracted to it. Put in a dental wick in that so that a little bit of the alcohol comes out, releases an odor. You can fill the bottom of that with soapy water, put the lid on it. And what I do is check this on a weekly basis. If there are beetles in here, count them up. You can then open up the bottom of this, let it drain out, and pour a little bit more soapy water in there so that you can come back a week later and sample again. The beauty of these is that when you get the first trap counts in here, you can put those preventive treatments onto the bark of the trees that you think might need it. I'm kind of a fan of
Dave may be having a problem with his internet, so we'll see.
Okay, so it wasn't us here in Lake County then.
No, this happened this morning on Beetle too, so.
Okay. Sign up for the 5G. That's what everybody's using now.
I don't know.
It's COVID, man. Oh, he dropped out?
Here, while you guys probably come back on.
Oh, there he is.
Unmute yourself, Dave. There you go. Can you hear us? Can you hear us, Dave? Maybe not.
some reason it wouldn't let me unmute
All right, good.
myself.
Let me make sure you still share.
Okay.
Oh, you're still a co-host, so go ahead, pick up for your Beetle or your
Ambrosia beetle.
Ambrosia Beetle slide
Yep.
up.
Okay. What I really wanted to point out to you is that, you know, the preventive materials, what I call, and I don't like preventive, I use the term prophylactic, because hopefully that will set up the proper mental image. I'm trying to use one of these insecticides to put a protective condom on the bark of the susceptible trees, and it only has to be from where the branch flare occurs down to the root flare, that central stem of the plant. And I need to put that application when I get the first beetles in my alcohol trap. And since none of these have a long residual on the bark, I'll probably have to repeat that every 10 to 14 days until I'm no longer getting beetles in my alcohol trap. I'm also a fan, map out where you're seeing this. If you're having this coming into the trees, what that's telling me is you probably have water, saturated soils in the springtime in those locations. And when you replant, those should be places that you want to plant trees that are not susceptible or not preferred by the ambrosia beetles, and plant other plants in those areas. Okay. The last one, I think we're running out of time here. The last one I want to talk about is the red-headed flea beetle. We had a lot of questions about flea beetles, and I'm going to be brutally honest with you. I think the 3 entomologists that have been doing all the work on this over in New York and North Carolina, South Carolina, are in I hope not to annoy anybody, but they're young kids that don't know what they need to know. They keep working on controlling the adults of these beetles, and they keep trying to drench what I call soft insecticides through the pots and so forth. I think some of you have been around. If you remember how we used to control black vine weevil, especially in containerized products, we would pre-mix permethrin or bifenthrin in the soil mix. And what that would do is that would provide you 1 year of protection from the black vine weevil. And my feeling is the larvae of this red-headed flea beetle are little beetle larvae that are feeding down in the root system in the potting mix, and you should be able to take them out that way also. And so nobody likes to I guess that's kind of gotten passe. Nobody wants to talk about it anymore. Remember, there are some restrictions with that. It's still on the label. You can still mix these insecticides with your potting mix, and whether it's a soilless or soiled mix. But the only thing that you've got to be aware of is that you have to handle that soil with gloves. You can't just use your bare hands with that, because it does have the insecticide in it. We don't want people coming into contact with the soil that might have that pesticide residue in it. But I think that might be one of the ways that you could consider taking this rascal out. I'm also a real fan of acelepryn. Acelepryn is pretty expensive, but some of the other neonicotinoids also work very good. Remember that if you use a neonicotinoid as a foliar spray, it will do a very good job of being translaminar. And remember that this flea beetle does what we call pit feeding. The adult beetles make these little shot holes or pit holes in the leaf surface. So if I have a insecticide that I know will kill beetles, and that would include any of the neonicotinoids, it would include acelepryn, should include acephate or orthene. That should take out these adult beetles as they're feeding. The problem with making the foliar applications is that, especially in the sun, it appears that the residues of many of those translaminar applied systemic insecticides often cease to be active in about 14 to 21 days. So you may need to make reapplications. But my approach to the red-headed flea beetle, let's go after the larvae. If they're in your containerized plant material, and then go after the adults using one of the other translaminar systemics that we know is effective in that situation. Speaking of the insecticides, let's quickly go through them. Tom, you wanted me to stop at 4 o'clock, right?
We do also have a question here.
Okay, let me take a break here. Questions?
Yeah, so will a drudge of imidacloprid in a container plant kill the flea beetle larva, imidacloprid?
I think it would, but the problem with imidacloprid is that it is so adsorbed onto organic matter that the only way that it would kill the insect is that if the insect was eating the potting soil. That bifenthrin in the potting mix has contact toxicity. In other words, there's enough residue on the pieces of soil and you know, even if it's bark material and so forth, that as the larva moves through there, it's going to pick that up and you know, get a toxic dose and take it out. So I think that's one of the problems that we're seeing. These guys have done studies where they have done drench through with the neonicotinoids and so forth, and they don't seem to achieve much good control with that. And I think it's because it's just too tightly bound up onto the organic surfaces, and the larvae aren't picking it up. It would have to be in the plant. And if you applied enough that the roots were picking it up, and then when that larva ate some of the root, it would then possibly ingest it. So I think that's one of the reasons why we're not good reports coming in from these folks in their studies with drenching through with neonics.
So it could be just the concentration of imidacloprid.
Oh yeah, and again, that's kind of I have to kind of smile on these because when I see the studies that these guys have done, they don't take a risk of going anything more than what's on the label, and in many cases if you check on especially the imidacloprid, there's a recommended rate, but then there's the high annual potential rate, and what these guys are using is the recommended rate, not what is the maximum allowed rate for the year. And it may be that maximum allowed rate. The other one, remember I mentioned that clothianidin? Clothianidin has always been my go-to of neonicotinoids when I have a tough to control insect. It is the most powerful of the neonicotinoids, and it is sort of intermediate in water solubility. It's we would consider it to be low water solubility, but it has a lot more solubility than imidacloprid. And so I would be really interested if you might try a drench through with clothianidin and see what that does to those. The other difference is clothianidin has an 8-week residual, while imidacloprid only has a 4-week residual. So
I don't think it even has that. I think it only has about 2 weeks.
yeah, you're probably right.
What is that chemical?
The clothianidin, what is there, do you have a product name for that?
Commercial.
Arena.
Oh, okay.
And remember that I mentioned that the Arena label for nursery production is pretty limited, but you are allowed here in the state of Ohio to use that product if it says nursery trees and shrubs and flowers. You're allowed to use that product up to the maximum label rate for an insect that might not be on the label, but you think it will be killed by that product. Okay.
Okay. Good.
Do you want to finish up with your chemistries? Because you had some slides to.
Yeah, I'm going to finish up just talking about some of the insecticides. I know the landscape people are really looking for alternatives. And I do notice there's a couple of greenhouses that actually have an organic section now in their stock that they say that these were not treated with neonicotinoids and other non-organic materials. And so just to let you know what is available out there. I think one of them that we've kind of lost track of, and we really don't have enough tests on right now is azadirachtin. Remember that this is a botanical insecticide. Now there are 3 formulations of this. There is an azatin, not azatin O, but there's just an azatin which uses artificial spreader stickers in it, which takes it off of the organic list. But there is an azatin O that is certified organic. And then there's 2 other trade names, Azagard and Nemix, which are certified organic. These seem to be fairly good at translaminar systemicity, not translocated, but translaminar. So this will get after some of the critters that are on the inside of the plants, specifically some of the leaf miners. Both of the sawfly leaf miners and dipterous leaf miners seem to be attacked by this one. All fairly good product for things like whitefly and mealy bugs and aphids. Does fairly well on some of those sucking insects. When it comes to the anthranilic diamides, these are the supposed substitutes or the alternates for the neonicotinoids. I think this is kind of a shell game going on this one. The first one that came out was chlorantranilopol. This is the darling of the anti-pesticide entomologists. And they came out, it has very low toxicity, has very low toxicity to bees, virtually non-toxic to bees. You can apply it when the flowers are in bloom and all the rest of that. Doesn't seem to cause any problem. The problem with this is that we assume that all the diamides then would have that same low toxicity to bees. But the second one to come out, cyantraniliprole from Syngenta, and again, this one has quite a broad range of activity here. But if you read the label, it's got a pretty significant bee warning in there. And so you wouldn't use this cyantraniliprole on plants that would pick this up and then flower or be flowering at the time that you would apply this. The other difference between these is that chlorantraniliprole was really only good on beetles and caterpillars. But if you'll notice that the mainspring now includes flies on that. So if you've got dipterous leaf miners and so forth, those would be alternatives. Now, these are not organic. Neither one of these are organic, but they would be alternatives for neonicotinoids if that is being requested. When it comes to the neonicotinoids, 2 of these, imidacloprid and thiamethoxam, are basically 2 peas in the same pod. Slow in uptake. They can be done as soil drenches or soil injection. You'll also notice that while imidacloprid has borers on it, for some reason thiamethoxam doesn't have the borers on that. So it's probably a pretty weak second to imidacloprid. The more active neonicotinoids, I've already talked about clothianidin. This is the one that I consider the strongest of all the neonicotinoids. Pretty rapid on uptake, has the longest residual in it. Safari has the fastest uptake. It's completely water soluble. It's one that you could spray on the trunk, be picked up that way, but it also has the shortest residual. It only has about a residual of it. While Arena, typically 6 to 8 weeks of effective residual in there. Notice that all these neonicotinoids have very severe bee warnings on them. You do not want to apply these on plants that are just about ready to flower or are in flower. The last one, acetamiprid, under TriStar, kind of gone under the radar. It was first only available as a bark spray or trunk injection for caterpillars. But over the last couple of years, they've added soft and armored scales to that product. When it comes to organophosphates, we do still have acephate or orthene. This is one of the products that I also recommend for peachtree borer. There are other acephate formulations that you can purchase for nursery production that can be either soil drenched or soil injected. And when you apply them that way, they'll be picked up by the vascular system. It's not a real rapid probably about a 2-week period for adequate uptake. We're actually using the product Lepitep here on campus for control of, oh, good Lord, what's the name? It's spongy moth. Okay, gypsy moth. We also get periodic outbreaks on campus, the forest tent caterpillar. And this can be applied early in the springtime by injecting it around the base of those trees, and it protects the trees from that. We also noticed that it took out the mimosa webworms out of our trees, honey locusts. So kind of an interesting product. Acephate orthene is an older product, but it's something you might want to consider, especially if you've got some caterpillar problems. When it comes to the pyrethroids, everybody's using bifenthrin. I just want to point out to you that there are other pyrethroids out there. Some of these do have some significantly different efficacy on specific targets. It's been my experience that scimitar and gamma and zeta cypermethrin actually have better beetle control. So if you're going after some of those flea beetles or going after Japanese beetles, these may be better choices than Tall Star, but Tall Star still does a pretty good job with those. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. Don't think you need any more news about bagworm or some of those other critters.
Any last minute questions for Dave? We do have a couple chem reps. Bob or Kim, did you want, and I think Dillman's in the room over with Ann. Did you guys want to chime in on anything? Because we did talk a little bit about chemistries.
Yeah, we have a question here, Tom.
All right, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so, Baseline, Battalion, and Onyx is a bifenthrin that's double the concentration with a penetrant. All the manufacturers claim it lasts 2 to 3 months in the bark. Does anyone know of any research on that at all to confirm that besides the manufacturers?
When it first came out, there were at least 3 or 4 publications that ended up in the insecticide and acaricide tests. My feeling is that you can expect 8 weeks of a residual. I think once you get past 8 weeks, the efficacy was beginning to drop off.
Okay, so and what's hot and humid, you don't want to spray it because it can burn. So that I just want to make sure someone else confirmed that. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. Bob, anything to add or question or chime in on the chemistries? Bob Crowley?
Yeah, I'm here, Tom. Hello, everybody. The only thing I would add as far as like a neonic replacement, I mean, we've had Altus out there, the flu partifuron molecule, for quite some time, and it also is very pollinator friendly, has no D-box language on it.
Okay. Tim, anything else to add? So Dave, just so you know, Bob is with Bayer and Kim is with BASF.
Mm-hmm. No problem. I've been friends with those people before.
Oh, there you go. They used to be my friends, but then I started working here. I'm just kidding. All right. Well, we're gonna stop the recording, and I got that in recording. I'm in big trouble. But anyways, we'll stop the recording. Dave, really appreciate you joining us today. We are not going to plow through IPM. I'm going to send out the minutes from IPM that we would have normally presented at this meeting. But again, thanks for joining us. Send those out.
You want me to send you the PowerPoint or just the
if you
recording
want,
file?
if you're okay, send it out. I'll add it with your recording. So
Okay.
I'm going to have to play with the recording a little bit because I know I have to put it through Adobe Rush and probably cut some stuff. Cut when you fall off there, face of the earth. But we're good. Thank you very much. Thank everybody for joining. Appreciate it. I'm going to stop the recording.